All right, so in this video, we are going over how to join a device to a domain. And we are also going to be configuring a user account so we can sign into that device using a domain user account. So right before we get started, just a quick explanation. The first thing we're actually going to need to do is create a domain controller. I'm going to be showing you guys how to create a domain controller using a Windows Server 2019 operating system. And we're going to go through this configuration pretty quick so we can get to kind of the beef of the video, which is joining to the actual domain. So again, the beginning of this video is just trying to show you guys how the configuration is actually set up in the back end of things before I show you how to join a device to this domain. So let's go ahead and get started. So the very first thing is we will need a server manager to open up on our Windows server and to add a Windows feature. So we're going to go ahead and see this page, hit next. We want role-based or feature-based installation. Continue, try to just leave everything as default. We don't need to mess with too much. So in here, we are going to want to use this here, which is Active Directory Domain Services. And I'm also going to use a domain name server. And those are the two things we need here. Go ahead and hit next, 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 install. As easy as that, this is how we get started with our domain controller. Generally speaking, you can add a couple more features like DHCP or a file server, which you can see here. But we are not going over that, so we're just going to do the domain controller. All right, so now that the installation is completed, we can go ahead and close this. We'll see these couple features on the left side. We have Active Directory Domain Services, and we also have DNS. These are the two services that we generally want on a domain controller. So let's go ahead and get to the next step. You'll see this little flag notification icon. Hit that, and you'll notice it says promote this server to a domain controller, and this is where the beef of the configuration comes in. So if you already have a domain in your environment, of course, you would use this first option, which is adding a domain controller to an existing domain. For us, since it is going to be all brand spanking new, we are going to be creating our own. So make sure you pick your domain name and add in something like .com, .org, or whatever. And then we just hit next. Here, once again, we're going to leave all of this as default. A read-only domain controller is just that. It's only read permissions. Usually this happens when you add more domain controllers to different sites and things like that. Default is perfectly fine. So let's enter in our password. So next, next, lots of nexts, and installs here in this configuration. And just keep on shuffling through here. Leave that as default. You don't generally want to change any of this. You can if you want, if you have some specific place you want all of these types of folders, but default is perfectly fine. That's what most people do anyway. And now we are finally all the way at the end. It will show you this prereq check. Typically you will have all of these warnings. You can ignore them and just hit install. Feel free to read them. They are kind of generic, but I digress. All right, so after the promotion, your computer will end up rebooting here. So make sure you sign in with your same credentials and you should be all set to go to start configuring your domain controller. Now, the very first thing that I am going to do is open up your tools and head over to Active Directory Users and Computers. So in here, without making anything too complicated, we're just going to go ahead and create our very first user. Let's name it Ryan Tech, name it Ryko Tech at rykotech.com. Okay, we'll do Ryko. Hit next, password, set your password. Not gonna do that. Finish, and voila, there we go. And voila, there we go. So I'm gonna go into my properties. I'm going to do member of, add, and I'm going to make myself a domain admin. And this really just means that I'm going to have permissions to just about everything. So I can start kind of configuring my entire network using my domain admin account. Just hit OK. And we're done. We're done creating our user. We're going to keep it nice and basic. Now the next step is to join that computer to the domain and then sign in with our user. So here's my Windows 11 computer. And the very first thing we're going to want to know is this device on the same network as your domain controller? Because if it's not, this is not going to work. Make sure your device can speak to that domain controller on a private network. Now, an easy way to test that is to see if you can ping your domain controller. So I'll just ping DC here. And as you can see, this device can reach my domain controller at this IP address. So now let's finally join the computer to the domain. This is going to be the same across any type of domain controller environment where you would be joining a device to the domain. So go to the start menu, go into settings, and I'm just gonna go ahead and maximize the screen so we can see a little bit better, and scroll all the way to the bottom where it says about. And here you can rename the PC, because whatever you rename it as and then join it, this is what's going to be the host name that shows up in Active Directory as the object name. Okay, so make sure you rename it first. That way you don't have any extra objects being created due to renaming different computers. Okay, so rename it first. I would suggest that you can actually do it at the same time. You can hit rename this PC, rename it. It's going to ask you to restart. You can restart later. And then we can go into this advanced system options. Go over to the computer name tab, hit change, and again, same thing here. You can change the computer name, and you can also hit this checkbox to join the domain. So whatever we set our domain as, I did rykotech.com, and just hit OK. Now this is the biggest thing. Now I did this on purpose. This error is very common and people just get a little bit confused, and okay, my computer can see the domain controller, but when I try to join the domain, I get an error. And why is that? It's because of pretty much just DNS. Your computer is not looking at the DNS of your domain controller, which means it cannot join the domain. So the very first thing we actually have to do is change where your DNS looks on your computer. So to do that, go into your network settings, Ethernet. You'll see here it says DNS server assignment, hit edit. We're going to make that manual, check that on, and here is our DNS settings. Right now it's DHCP. If you're at a home network, DNS server will end up being your home router address, or rather your ISP, right? So it's going to use the DNS server of whatever internet service provider that you have is, and we are going to change that to point to our Ryko domain controller. And if you remember when we pinged it, 192.168.1.75, let me double check that. Yes, 75. So make sure that is correct. You can make an alternate DNS. I like to use this. This is Google's DNS. This is kind of our backup right now since we only have one domain controller. If this does not work for whatever reason, it'll kick over to this DNS server, and that way we don't lose connectivity. So go ahead and hit save. We're going to go back over to our change. Go in here, type in rykotech.com. And as you can see, we no longer get that error, okay? So make sure your DNS server is pointing to your domain controller before you join a device to the domain. Now, these are the credentials to have access to join a device to the domain. So if the user account that you're using does not have the credentials or permissions to join a device to the domain, this will not work. So make sure you use a user that has the correct permissions. In my case, I created a domain admin. So let's go ahead and use the domain admin credentials. So as you recall, if we go to domain controller and check out my Ryan Tech user, our username is just Ryko. So let's type in Ryko and the password that I set for it. Give it a second and bang. Now we have welcome to the domain. We are finished. We have showed you guys how to rename the computer, how to join the computer to the domain, how to change your DNS, and how to set up a domain controller at the very bare minimum. So let's go ahead and restart the computer so you guys can see what it looks like on a computer that is now joined to the domain. All right, so here I am trying to remote back into the computer that we just rebooted. Now we are going to use the domain credentials to sign into this. And how to do that is you write your domain first, use a backslash, and then type in the username, okay? So this is going to be domain name, username, and then your password. And there we go. Now we're signing in. As you can see, this is actually like the display name here. If you remember, we can go actually back to this really quick. We have username is Ryko. The display name is here, which is Ryan Tech. And you can find that information in this general tab, right? So we set up the first name, we set up the last name, and then it automatically creates this display name as Ryan Tech. And now that's it, guys. We have created a domain controller. We have created a user account. We have joined a computer to the domain and then signed in with our user account. Now the sky's the limits from here. We can do tons of things. Okay, we can use different types of permissions and security groups, configure group policies, and there's tons of stuff to go over, and I'm happy to do that in my future videos. I just noticed my camera died. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and ignore that, but thank you so much for watching. If this helped you guys out, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment. Happy to answer any questions, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. All right, thanks a lot.